Developmental Language Disorder: An Appeal for Increased Government Support in the School Board Setting by Thomas SamsonWilliams, BSc, Speech-Language Pathology student. My name is Thomas SamsonWilliams. I am a second-year student in the Speech-Language Pathology program at Western University in London, Ontario. I have created this presentation to raise awareness among Ontario policymakers about developmental language disorder, or DLD, a relatively unknown but prevalent communication disorder, and its effects on the children who have it. My aim is to highlight the lack of awareness about this disorder as compared to other similarly prevalent or rarer neurodevelopmental disorders. I then intend to tie this discussion of DLD into a broader conversation about school board SLP funding and staffing, and how these issues affect children with DLD in particular. Thank you for your time and your attention. What is DLD? DLD is a communication disorder that causes difficulties across language domains. These language difficulties must be persistent and have a significant negative impact on social interactions or educational progress. These language impairments can appear in all domains of language, but in school-age children, they are most significant at the sentence and discourse levels, beyond the single word or sound level. They also tend to appear both in the production of language and in the understanding of language, and across modalities, that is, in writing, reading, speaking, and listening. A defining feature of DLD is that the associated language impairments cannot be explained by an existing biomedical condition that commonly has a language disorder as part of its presentation, for example, autism, intellectual disability, hearing loss, or brain injury. So a child with a differentiating condition like autism would not be defined as having DLD, but a language disorder associated with autism. However, DLD can co-occur with conditions that are not known to have a language disorder as a common feature of their presentation, such as ADHD, developmental coordination disorder, auditory processing disorder, and dyslexia. Despite the impairments seen in DLD being specific to language, it has wide-ranging effects on the children who have it. DLD is associated with academic difficulties throughout development and lower academic qualifications in young adulthood. Along with much higher rates of reading and spelling difficulties than the average child, children with DLD are also more likely to struggle with math. They tend to struggle the most on tasks with higher verbal demands, such as counting and arithmetic, as compared to number lines and magnitude comparison, which have lower verbal demands. In terms of psychosocial difficulties, boys with DLD are more likely to engage in delinquent behavior, and girls with DLD are more likely to experience sexual abuse. Adults with DLD are also more likely to face periods of unemployment than other adults, and rates of anxiety and depression are higher in children with DLD as well. So how common is DLD? Estimates place it at a prevalence of around 7.6%, making it around 7 times more prevalent than autism, and about equally prevalent as ADHD, which sits at 8%. Despite this, public awareness surrounding DLD is shockingly low. A 2023 online survey of the general public in Australia, distributed via Facebook advertisements, compared awareness of DLD to awareness of ADHD, dyslexia, and autism, and found that despite the high prevalence of DLD, only about 19.9% of respondents had heard of it, as compared to 97.4% for autism, 97.7% for ADHD, and 98.5% for dyslexia. And even those who had heard of DLD had a limited understanding of its characteristics. Part of this limited awareness may be due to inconsistencies in the labeling of DLD. It is being referred to and continues to be referred to in some circles by a vast array of different labels. This can be confusing to parse and thus create difficulties developing a broad public awareness of the condition. This also makes advocacy and outreach efforts difficult. This is why there's been a movement, especially over the last decade, to use the label DLD universally, but this is still an ongoing process and will take time. Increased public education on this topic can help ease this process. A study in Europe that focused on the awareness of the concept of DLD rather than the specific term had a higher estimate of awareness at 59%, but this was still much lower than for ADHD at 80% and autism at 90%. So even when controlling for the terminology confusion, awareness is still low, though unified use of the term DLD may help as it becomes the standard and allows for more focused public outreach and education efforts. It's fair to assume that the situation in Canada is not much different, as Australia and many European countries have organizations working towards public awareness of DLD. If more public resources are directed towards these advocacy efforts in Ontario, the situation will likely improve. Another Australian study focusing on understanding of DLD traits in teachers found that many teachers did not have a high level of understanding regarding the characteristics of DLD and how it affected education. This highlights the need for increased teacher training efforts, as teachers get a high level of exposure to children in school, and therefore have the opportunity to observe their language a great deal in a natural setting. If they have a good understanding of the traits of DLD, they can more adequately address their students' needs and help in catching any children that may have previously slipped under the radar for SLP intervention. In Ontario, school-based language intervention is often structured using a tiered approach, with increasing individualization and specialization of intervention as children's needs increase. The evidence supports this approach, with demonstrated effectiveness of non-SLP-led intervention in tiers 1 and 2, that is, intervention provided to all children and intervention targeted at children with language weaknesses, respectively, with more need for SLP-directed intervention at Tier 3, which is the individualized service level. Overall, targeted intervention of language impairment is found to be effective in children with DLD, with many studies showing improvement in the targeted areas post-treatment. Classroom-based intervention alone is not enough to address all of the needs of high-risk children, such as those with DLD, in many cases. Individualized intervention is needed for many domains, and this requires sufficient resources and specialized staff such as SLPs to provide it. Here in Ontario, school-based SLP services are funded by the Ministry of Education. This funding comes from a combination of sources, some from the People Foundation grant and some from the supplemental grants. Within the supplemental grants, SLP funding generally comes from the special education grants and the language grant. The special education portion of this funding is often allocated at the school board's discretion to any of the areas that fall under special education. There is no guaranteed amount allocated to SLP services. In addition, the same funding pool applies to psychologists and psychometrists, along with other professionals who support special education. A qualitative study interviewing 24 Ontario School Board SLPs demonstrated that challenges related to personnel and time were a prominent concern among this group, and that funding was perceived to be limited by many. Another problem related to funding is the high caseloads and low staffing of school board SLPs. A survey report conducted by the Ontario Association of Speech-Language Pathologists and Audiologists, or the OSLA, in 2021 found that the student-to-SLP ratio among Ontario school board SLPs was a mean of just 1 SLP per 3,182 students. Overall, there has been a downward trend in this metric since measurement began in 1998. However, an advocacy organization, the Ontario Association for Families of Children with Communication Disorders, recommended a minimum ratio of 1 to 1,500, so there's still much progress to be made. In terms of caseload, the average SLP was reported to service 160 to 240 children per school per year. A 2003 study requested by SAC stated that caseloads of 40 or fewer would be recommended, given the negative impact high caseloads had on service outcomes in schools. These issues are compounded in the case of DLD, given the lack of awareness previously discussed. I hope that this presentation has furthered your knowledge of DLD and of the many challenges faced by children with DLD. I also hope that the discussions of the lack of awareness and training surrounding DLD and the lack of funding and staffing for SLP services in school boards have shed light on these issues. Greater funding of SLP services and of advocacy and training efforts targeted towards DLD would be a great step towards ameliorating the situation for the many children in Ontario who have DLD. Thank you once again for your time.